So what I and some of the stuff is there is some docs for this. I've been trying to get some things in the dev guide, but I'm going to try and show you some of how this works. Okay, and I'm going to do it out of the OpenCrowbar stuff because all the code's in one place. I don't have to jump at the top level to show you this. Okay. Okay, so in Rails, what we've got is, all right, is everybody comfortable with the way that roles are objects? So the first thing people should be aware of, NodeRoles, we use a lot of subclassing behavior when this works. NodeRoles aren't subclass, NodeRoles are just NodeRoles. But all the work for NodeRoles is actually done in the role code. So if you look at role, it implements some methods that are critical to making everything work. And this is one of the key things that I wanted to highlight today, is these transition roles, and also NodeRole and NodeCreate. So hopefully everybody's comfortable with at this point. So let's do two things. I'm going to bring that up, and I'm going to bring up NodeRole. So NodeRole has stores data. Shoot, and this just got a little bit more complex because it stores data in in a NodeRole datum class. Let me explain how this goes. I think I have a drawing that would be useful too. I updated the database schema drawing, so let me pull that together. Because one of the changes that Victor made with some of the attribute cleanup was to move where the data is stored. Good. Okay. What this is so all right. I'm going to work from the drawing a little bit. So the center of everything in Crowbar 2 is NodeRole. Right? NodeRole carries state. NodeRole is effectively the gating process, right? Everybody should be well aware of this. As you build up the roles for the workloads that you're putting together, what you're really doing is you're creating a NodeRole graph. So the roles are going to be directly translated into NodeRoles when you add them to a deployment. So actually, when you add them to a deployment and then associate a node with them, it's when you take that action, it builds a graph for that node in the deployment graph. Does that make sense for everybody? So these NodeRoles are effectively interrelated to each other, and that's missing in this graph. There's a many-to-many table that joins them. I'll add it to this picture, but there is a table. I got the echo again. Wayne, were you going to make a comment?
Yeah, I was going to talk this. Sorry.
Okay. So there's a in Rails, they don't show up as tables. They don't show up as objects, but there's a has and belongs to many table that joins NodeRoles back to NodeRoles. So when you take the action of adding a node to a role in a deployment, that action creates not only the one node role between the node and the role, but it actually creates the whole graph from that node role upstream in the relationship, and it builds a whole bunch of node roles. And then it also builds the graph relating node roles to all the other node roles. Yes, there is a method called where is it? Add node. I think it's in role. Okay, yep. Add node, add to node. So what happens is in the role class, when you add a node to a snapshot, it goes through and builds up the whole dependency graph. You can see there's a lot of code in this. Peers by role. It looks to see if it's a cluster. It finds all the parents. So this piece of code right here builds when you add a node to a snapshot for a role, it goes in and creates the graph here. Yeah, that's right. Right. So when Crowbar YAML is created, when Crowbar YAML is imported, so I guess we're doing code walkthrough, so I'll show you where the code is. So there's a BarClamp import. The main thing, only real thing in BarClamp is import now. So when the BarClamp is imported, it creates all of the role relationship graph. Right? Here's where it actually creates the roles, and it works through this role required graph. That's what builds the graph up, and it should be in the picture. Yes, role requires. So when you import the roles, it creates this relationship graph in role requires. Yeah. Hmm. That is right. The thing that makes that even more complex, I've been working on ways to visualize it because it's so painful to debug, is that you not only have forward and backward relationships on the individual node, you also have cross relationships to other nodes, which makes perfect sense, right? So if your DNS server, every node has a DNS client, the DNS client has a child relationship to the DNS server, and also the DNS database. And so when you create that node role, it actually creates a whole series of relationships, including one of the things that's in here is the concept of a cluster. Sorry, no, I'm in the wrong one. Back to role. You'll notice there's actually there's a whole bunch of concepts in here, like clusters and things like that. And so this is a place where the complexity. This is the place where you would expect to find the complexity for Crowbar, because the way we build this graph determines most of the behaviors for Crowbar. And so I guess the number one takeaway from today is going to be helping you find the places to look for the code when you have questions. And I hope that's my goal for this. Yay. Okay. Yeah. Uh, so to answer that question, I can give you an answer from a Crowbar 2 perspective, because I had to change it to make Crowbar 2 work. So Crowbar 2 collapsed all of the core BarClamps into a single thing, which is so much easier to work with, I can't tell you. And one of the consequences of that is that there is now a BarClamps directory where exactly what you suggested. So this only has the role information for that BarClamp. So the DNS, and it automatically resolves, there's a way that it automatically resolves all this stuff. So yeah, we could rename the root Crowbar YAML to be Crowbar YAML, but in this case, it's actually Now it's pretty straightforward. If you're looking for the logging roles, they're all in one place together, and it's just that. And so the files are much simpler. Um, I think that makes sense. It really doesn't matter at all because when you import it, you get to say what it is. You're so for Crowbar, it's defaulting to Crowbar right now, but it since that action is determined uh, in the migration, so there is a BarClamp import. So you could pass whatever name resolved here, and you can pass the file name in as an additional parameter, or if you need to change the code so that you can change it. Right. But this, when you run Crowbar, it actually the import of all the BarClamps from the YAML files is done during this import phase. At which point all the roles are populated and all that stuff. That's when all that comes in. This code is not called until you actually create the node role. And so that ends up being a very important event. Right? We still haven't gotten to attributes, but this is critical to understanding that. So I'm pausing for a second for questions.
Well, this is why to point out that what I'm talking about in the OpenCrowbar repository, not the code that.
Correct. I'll try and be careful. The only difference between the two right now is the BarClamp, the way we import BarClamps, and the docs code is shifted. But this code, it should be identical unless somebody's changed it in the last couple days. Should be identical between the two sites. So I have both on. The advantage of showing you here is that when I want to show you all the BarClamp code is here, and there's no extra navigation I have to do. So that was one of the big changes for OpenCrowbar was that all the BarClamps are collapsed. All the core ones are collapsed into one repo. So you won't have, like, if you have to make one change to NTP, it's not a separate pull request across two different repos. All right, and that's actually a good stopping point, or a good transition point. So we've covered how NodeRoles get created. I was talking about the complexity that got added recently with this NodeRole data. So the way this works is NodeRoles are predominantly holders for the relationships between nodes and roles, and snapshots, right? So it's important to remember snapshots are time series, help us create time series for deployments. And NodeRoles contain the state. So they're used by the annealer to determine when things get handed, the order that things get handed off to the jig to actually run the chef code or script or whatever we're executing. There is data associated with a node role, but what we found was a lot of times a node role would go through a transition, but the data wouldn't change. And we actually want to make sure that we aren't showing changes of data when there aren't any. And so one of the optimizations that Victor made was to take the data for that node role and put it into a separate object. It's basically it's a denormalization of stripping away the data on the expectation that we only need to change that data, that node role data, if it changes. So don't expect the data in the node role data to be updated, expect it to be replaced. It's a create and change the reference approach, because we never want to throw away old data. And that's what that model does. A lot of this is handled transparently. So if you look at the node role model, it's going to get where's system? Here's data. Here's where it gets data, system data. Those things it's just going and pulling it from it does it basically transparently because of the object relationships. Okay, and so there's specific methods to update the wall, to update system data. It's worth noting, this can be confusing. There's two ways to do this. The idea is if you're doing system data equals, you're replacing all of the JSON. If you're doing a system data update, you are you're incrementally changing the JSON. So if you now we're getting almost to the attribute component. If I was going to make changes to the JSON data in a NodeRole, which is where the attribute data is stored, I have three ways to do it. I can replace all of it using the system data equals or data equals. I can pass in just a JSON snippet. This is actually a hash that I want added to the JSON information. Or I could use the attribute system. And the attributes have a get and a set process here, where if I can look up an attribute for a NodeRole and then set or get just the one attribute. And the way that works is there's code in the attribute file that looks at the attribute metadata, figures out what type of data it is, where the data is supposed to come from, and then it basically writes the JSON key into the right mapping location or extracts it. I'm going to repeat that to make sure it's clear. So let me pull up a template. Let's see, is this a good one? Nope. Attributes or mappings. Why is all this missing? These aren't right. There's one. Attributes don't store anything. This is what's confusing. Attributes or mappings. Okay. I'm not saying you're confused yet. The attributes, so the data or the attributes themselves. Sorry. So yeah. The value always ends up. No. You're exactly at the right place. The values for attributes are always stored in the system data JSON. That's not true. Almost always stored so Crowbar mostly stores JSON blobs. That's the main thing by design. The main thing we store are JSON blobs. And if you look at the templates, I lost the template I had open. This isn't it. Here it is. So if you look at this template is a JSON, right? This is eventually going to become NodeRole data, the NodeRole system data. This JSON data is effectively a little database, and if I want to talk to the least time for my DHCP server, the data is 60, right? Mike, does that make sense? The attribute is 60. There's a mapping, Crowbar DHCP least time, that is the key for that. So on the NodeRole, so for the provisioner DHCP server NodeRole, if I want the least time, I have to know the key path Crowbar DHCP least time to look it up out of this data bag. Or if I want to set it, I have to know that so I can set it in the least time. And this is actually, it's a little cumbersome, right? So if I just wanted to make that one change, what I would do is I would make a hash like this, set the value to 60, and call system update with that hash in it, and that would update 60 to 55 or 100, whatever. Correct. There's an important exception, which is when we have something like the network, which uses a database to store this. I'll show that too. But I want to get this is the 99% case, is when we store it as JSON data. So there's a sustainability problem, which is that not everybody, you don't want to, if somebody changes the JSON map, then everything breaks, because the danger here is that we end up coding Crowbar DHCP server lease time into everything, right? Cookbooks and recipes and this and that. And then if we're using an upstream cookbook that doesn't want to use Crowbar DHCP lease time as their index, we're stuck. And so we had to come up with a way to abstract that out. And that's what the attributes are. So the attribute system, where is it? Attrib is right here. What the attrib system does is it comes in and it maps. So let's see, this is role template from provisioner. So what happens is where is the lease time? I should actually have a mapping for it. Okay. Oh, that's DHCP, sorry. That should be in here. All right. Default. Oh, yeah, I might not have gone far enough down. But okay, I'm not going to spend more time trying to connect these 2 points that I sort of picked at random. But the idea here is that when I create an attribute here, it's going to map into this thing. So I could go to provisioner available OSs. I should be able to go to the provisioner. Should be in here. Oh, here we go. This one is a lot more. So provisioner. So if I go back to my provisioner YAML, Crowbar provisioner server access keys, I should be able to go here and say Crowbar provisioner server, and there should be an access keys somewhere in here. I don't know why it's not. Oh, is that okay? That's why I'm not. I picked the wrong example. Oh, I think you're right. All right, so this is actually really good because we'll talk through how you make these into reasonable things. But Mike, the idea here is that this map allows you to abstract the JSON mapping here into a generic name. And this is really important. So this key, this attribute key, becomes this mapping. That mapping becomes looks up data here. And then the thing that got added recently is this wants attributes. Let's see if I have an example of one. Here it is. So the wants attributes is smart enough to, when it composes the data, it looks it up from the data, finds the key, and then maps it into a new path so that you can control how the data is injected. Mm-hmm. There's a couple ways to override it. Yes. So the template is just the base. It's the default. So when there's 2 places to overwrite it. So when you put a role in a deployment, it creates a deployment role model. That's this. So I have a deployment. I add a role to the deployment. That action of connecting deployment and role together creates a deployment role. Deployment roles have a copy of the template that you can modify. So the first level of override from default says that when I create a deployment, that relationship copies this template into that, and then I can make copies. I can make changes. So I could then come and say, instead of online false, I want for this deployment to be online true. Or I want to use a different web port, or I want to change the available operating systems, or my password hash. I could, instead of changing the default, when I create the deployment, I could change the deployment role for this role to, something else. And then, but that's at the deployment level. When I actually attach a node to that role, then it creates a node role, and the node role first looks to its own data store, then it looks to the deployment role's data store. So I can modify it here, which is really node role, and then anything that's not overridden here. So one of the things that is really interesting is a lot of times the node role data is completely blank, because everything that you're doing is actually applied from the deployment role. Yeah, that's exactly right. If you have a setting that you want the same on every node, you'd set it in deployment role. Right. You're welcome. And then when the data is merged together before a jig run, it pulls data in. And Chef has a very similar concept. It's no surprise. There's a precedence. It pulls data from the node role and then from the deployment role. And then because deployments are hierarchical, it's going to pull data. No, it won't. It doesn't. I don't think it merges from one deployment role to another. It only goes one level at this point. So the place, let me show you the place where that is done. So the place where that code is pulled together is out of run. Actually, there's two places where it's pulled together. In role, there is a. Sorry, here's where it gets template information. There's a file. Maybe it's in NodeRole where it preps the data. Deployment data. Okay. So this is a really key thing to understand when we're talking about attributes. In the workflow of running a node role, the node role, the jig is passed a JSON blob of information. That the JSON blob that it gets, or JSON data that it gets, is controllable by the node role. So let me show you. So where we actually run, where's the run? This enqueues it, but there's another run where we actually pass it the data. It must be a node role. Let's see. Where did that go? The state's a really important method, and we'll get to it in a minute. I'm looking for the actual run code. Where did it go? Oh, sorry. Okay, I've been out of the code a little bit. Day too long. This actually tells you everything you need to see in a way. When a node role is ready to be handed to a jig, the jig run method is called. And the jig run gets a node role and gets the data. This is the top level jig, so it can't do anything. A jig is required to have a run method. So if you look at the, let's see, the Crowbar jig, it actually has a run method, and then this does all that SSH, SCP, execute. So this is actually the script jig code that's doing the running. So if you want to see where script jig does its thing, it's here. The chef jig is here in the chef BarClamp, and it has its own. It preps the run and it runs it, and this does all of the chef actions that are necessary to run run that. The thing that's important to understand is the data is composed by the node role. Oh, sorry, by the role. Role. No, I've now opened a lot of windows. So, is that right? Or is it by the node role? Darn it. Victor would be spinning. His head would have exploded by now. So what happens is that when we're about to run a jig, we call those merge compositions. I'm trying to find where that code was. It's just in front of me a second ago. Here it is. Sorry. So the node role calls these data prep, and it pulls together all of the data that it needs based on the calls out of here. And some of these go back into the role and do it. But if you're looking to unwind it, which I'm assuming you guys are doing, the data that's being fed into a chef run, right, which is the attributes, so it's the node role and the attributes that you want that we're injecting, that data is prepped out of the run model, which actually builds up that system data. Okay, builds that data up by pulling the data out of all of the different data. And this is the reason I got in this convoluted path was looking at the hierarchies. So, right, this is how we're pulling that together. Did that make sense? We're literally in the most complex parts of the operation of Crowbar. So, sure. Yeah. Mhm. I'm glad you asked. I used to have a to-do for that. Let's see. In the No, I took it out. Okay, I used to. I got bugged by seeing a to-do in there every time. So yes, the idea would be in the discovery right here, you could actually validate. We know the node role. We could write a validator, JSON validator metadata, and then before you accepted the discovery data, you could validate the JSON as valid JSON before you would raise if the JSON wasn't valid. So very much, I'd love to see us do that. It's very doable. It's a matter of starting it out, right? You start off with basically a anything goes schema validation, and then you'd build up you'd basically defend yourself as you found issues. But since everything in Crowbar runs through that, a little bit of medicine would go a long way, if that makes sense, right? Because ultimately, every time you exercise any changes to a node role, you have to update that data to some extent, and so being able to validate it would be useful. But no, it's a great question. This is exactly where you would do it. And you could uh, and there's a lot of ways to validate this because when you retrieve the object, you actually get back the the JSON, so you could actually make you could do it after the fact, but I'd really like to see it done here, and it could be done very in a very dry way. I mean, don't repeat yourself, where you write it one validation approach that works for all the ways we set the data. And as a minimum, we could probably do it out of attributes. Attributes can also validate that they're valid. But I do historically, I mean, I'm jumping around a little bit. Historically, it was faster to hard code the paths. We knew that wasn't long term, and so if you see hard code paths in here, understand that ultimately we want to replace them for these semantic attributes and use attributes to do all the mapping, not the hard coding. Right. I would, and this is one of those places where I'm okay with the technical debt, but I definitely want us to address it because I think it's one of those things where it's going to burn us, and I hope when it burns us, we fix it then. We put in the semantic checks at that point. And it might be sooner rather than later. It depends on if somebody has to itch to scratch. I will say for the record, if you do choose to do that, we should do it as a story because there's customer value. So scratch the itch, but let's make sure there's a story tracking it because I wanna claim victory. All right. So now yeah, yeah. You should. You don't have to. So they have to. So they sort of. I would say they have to be in the template. Um, or that would be, it would be preferable for this to be a complete set. Ideally, they would, all the ones in the YAML this would be a complete set. And I think that if they were here, you could say they don't need to be in here. So I think over time, I'd like to see these files all disappear in favor of this, because this is so much more explicit, right? We know we have a top level key, we have a description of what it's supposed to do, so it's semantic, and but there's no value, and we could easily add to this a default. Um, mhm. A path to TFTP boot, like oh, sorry, yep. So this is just a value. So this just the fact that it has a slash in it is not that material. It's crowbar provisioner server root, and then TFTP boot is just the value for that. Mm-hmm. All right, that is an excellent lead-in to my next topic. So I will dive in, but I want to make sure we answer questions on this before I go to that. Cool. Okay. All right. Now I'm worried. Yes, that role produces those attributes. That would show up in the server role. This is a server role, but that would show up. That would so that's the trick, is that if it's passed across, then it's a dependency in the chain. And so what you would do is, and we've cheated on the namespace. It's a flat namespace for attribs. So if I had a provisioner client that needed something from provisioner server, it would say, I want this attrib. And that attrib, it would be able to look it up in the attrib list and then resolve. So it's a two-way map. This is a really good question. Yeah. Hmm. Yes. Here's one. Right. Mm. Right. It does show up in Crowbar YAML for the SQL Server and as an attribute on the SQL Server. So yeah, here's the thing that's interesting, right? You've got a SQL client, and it needs an attribute from the SQL Server, which makes perfect sense. The way it works is Crowbar, when it resolves the attributes, is going to look up your dependency graph, your NodeRole graph, to find the nearest attribute that applies to the one you're asking for. Right? Right. But all those attributes are collected from its upstream dependencies, and the server is one of its dependencies. So you get when that attribute when the JSON data is passed to you with your attributes in it, it includes the upstream server attribute, which you can then go get. This is right. So every yeah. Okay. Okay. Hmm. Wants attribs SQL timeout. That's right. Hmm. You have to do the wants attribs. You have to have a producer for it. You can't just have a wants without a producer. That's a good question. I wouldn't use the wants for that. I would use the wants is really for cross-role requests, not intra-role. I guess you could, but you don't really need to.
That one role can produce the value for an attribute, and that can be passed across.
Ah, so let me break that into two problems. One is the Crowbar YAML piece, and then the next one is the piece that answers. I'm going to answer your question by showing you how do we generate data that's not in the template. Um, So you have to have the, so if you're, let's say you're a SQL client role would have to have a requirement for the SQL Server role, and then the SQL Server role would have to produce the attribute that you want, and then the SQL client role would have to ask for that attribute. So in this case, the provisioner, so let's see, this role, so here's a role called provisioner repos, and it wants the provisioner package repos list, right? Provisioner package repo is up here in the provisioner server. So what you'll notice is the provisioner repo role has a requirement on provisioner server, right? So this role that wants this attribute must have this server. It'd be actually smart to have, going back, channeling Rick for a second, it'd be, I don't know how specific the checks are in this dependency resolution. This is also a dependency graph. Because right, if I wanted this but didn't have a dependency on a role that provided this attribute, I should fail the import, because at that point I have an invalid schema, invalid Crowbar YAML schema. And right, and one of our goals here is to be loosely coupled. So we're using a name match to link these attributes together. It's better than the whole mapping, but it's still loosely coupled. And so that's the. I hope does that help explain the relationship in the Crowbar YAML, Chris? You're if yeah, if you only have one role, you're going to get all of your JSON data anyway, and you don't need the mapping path. Right. Correct. If you're just dealing with your own data, you don't need anything. It'll just pass you your own data. You always get your own data. So whatever is in your template, yep, whatever's in the effectively the template plus your overrides for it, you'll get that. So in this case, the provisioner server will regardless of what's in this, should get all of that, whatever in that JSON file. The things that we're controlling, that we're trying to limit you from getting, is all the upstream JSON. So the early version of Crowbar 2, you would get all of the JSON from all of your upstream node roles, which is a big set, and had no abstraction. In Crowbar, with the attribute system, you only get the data that you want, that you ask for, and that means that you get your own data plus a much smaller set of JSON. Yes, that would be the way I'd describe it. It's basically your pub sub list.
That's not how it would work. You could have the client depend on the server, even though the server's installed on the client. Okay,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to hold on for a second, because I'm bound and determined to answer Regini's question from this morning. I want to pause this because I want to get to that. And then we're clearly going to do more, and we'll go back, because this is very iterative, right? You understand one, and this is I had to come up to speed as we did this too. So you're going to understand one piece of it, and then we're going to go in circle, and then understand another piece, and everything will make sense over time. Yeah. You specify your role, your overrides in the deployment role. So deployment role has data and wall. So this is a place where you put your overrides. So actually, when you create the deployment role, it copies the template into the deployment role. All right, so when you have the snapshot page, and it starts off with no roles in it, and you say, I want to add this role to my deployment, and then you click Add. So you have the pull-down list for all the roles, and you click Add. That creates a deployment role. So there's actually an object created when so you haven't attached any nodes yet, but in the deployment, you now have this this relationship. That's a deployment role. And that the action of creating the deployment role copies the template into the data. It actually copies the template in. So once you've created a deployment role, you can't change the template anymore. You've copied it. Now, if you create a new deployment role, it'll recopy the template from the role. But okay. Sorry. Got it. That I can answer to. So here's the way that works. That's what these transition roles are for. So all of these on methods, you'll notice they don't do anything except they just have loggers. So the default role class has stubs in there for responding to different state changes, and also node creation and node removal. And what happens is every time when you add a node role, and the deployment role actually has similar stuff. Here it is. On deployment create, on deployment delete. So all of these on things happen at specific times. On deployment create and on deployment, these two are and we actually have some docs on this. Those methods get called when you create a deployment role. So if I wanted to make a global change to a deployment to the template, when I create, I would override this method. So on deployment create, I can actually take advantage of when that happens to change the template data or build the whole darn template. So if I had a role that all the data was going to be generated, then I would, on deployment create, I would add that at that time. So realistically, let me see if I have one of those. Let's see. It's not finding. There it is. Okay. See, I don't have a lot of examples of this, of where we do this in the code. But what you would do is, in this, you would override this role. So let me find a role that we've overridden. Here's good. Here, this one has fine examples. So provisioner OS install. So this is a role, and when a node role, any OS provisioner OS install node role is transitioned to proposed, we go in and we set the system data to this value. We're not actually we're not generating this every time. It's only when it's created. So you would do the same thing. This is the actual answer to Regini's question. If you wanted to generate a password for a SQL server, you would create a role, you would create an override for the SQL Server role, just like I did here. So BarClamp provisioner OS install role. Yeah. The name is important if you want to use the defaults. I believe in the YAML you can override the class. It's not, we use the defaults so heavily we don't have it, but there's a way you can actually specify class and say what the class is in this. Class of the model that overrides it. So if I wanted the OS, the provisioner OS install to use a different class. Actually, this will be a good example. If I wanted class of role, it's a subclass of role. So when the role is when I import the provisioner OS role. So let me go over here. Provisioner. Let's see. Oh, OS install. So there should be a provisioner OS install role. Here it is. So provisioner OS install. This name decomposes automatically into provisioner OS install this role name. It actually looks it up, and so when you import this Crowbar YAML and it hits that line, it goes into the data set and it finds that that role, and it actually tells the role, hey, you don't use the base class, use this override class. And then right, and that's why in the Crowbar YAML you can change the role. You can change the class name. So
portions of the JSON be completely different.
right. So either way, you should be covered for that. For the core stuff, it's really convenient. All the models follow the convention, and coding by convention's easy. But what happens is that when this node role goes through the proposed state, so that's basically the first state that it always achieves, it's going to inject this data into that node role. And so that means for if you were to inspect all the node roles in that deployment, they would all have this piece of data set based on their deployment data. Right, so it's actually going to look up deployment data, which deployment data I think is coded. Let's see, NodeRole. So deployment data is coded to actually go to the deployment role and pick up its top level data. So this is actually potentially redundant because it should do that automatically anyway. So for some reason, when Victor wrote this, he decided he wanted to hard code. I think I know his rationale, but he actually specifically sets the target OS for each node role. But this is where you would do it. So if I wanted to have a database password or a user, and I wanted to code those in programmatically, this is where I'd do it. And because it's code, I could look up information from other places. I can generate it and store. I can do all sorts of things. If the most sophisticated examples of these are in the network BarClamps, where we actually don't store JSON at all, but we generate it all dynamically. So in those cases, we override all that stuff. It is called every time that node role goes through the proposed phase. So it's unproposed is really helpful because it's really called when before the user changes it, when the user goes into proposed state. But you can hook off any transition. So if you wanted to do validation, you could actually hook into the on to do event, and you could validate that everything was okay on to do. When things go active, you can hook into a lot of these. Frankly, we don't use most of these but we left them there because they cover all the possible state transitions that a node role goes through. OnProposed is really the primary one. Hold on a second. All right, sorry. Praveen is pinging me. He was trying to join a meeting that happened yesterday, and we got confused about time zones. Sorry. Go ask your question again, Regini. The system data, it does it by merge, so it shouldn't replace it. It'll just merge in. So you shouldn't, if it changes system data, if a jig run changes system data, that'll be reflected as it'll merge. It should merge and create a new NodeRole data model or attribute. But this is something that's gotten a little fuzzy to me, and I would love to have Victor help clarify. But because the way Wayne and I were talking about that this morning. I'm going to defer to Victor and have him explain when we use the wall and when we use the system data, because I think that we've been moving away from the wall. We don't need it as much as we used to. I don't know if that answers. I know it doesn't answer the question, but I don't know if that was the area you were asking about. Okay. Some of this is a little fuzzy, and I'm committing to get better answers for you on the system data versus wall data, because we have to resolve that. The key thing that I felt like was blocking you for right now was understanding that you need, in order to inject a password or any other generated data, what you need to do is you need to take your you need to create a role override, and then you have to define the event handler for dealing with that. And there's actually a lot of really good examples for this that do different things. So this one sets the target OS whenever you create a new proposal, and then when that node role is transitioned, it goes in and makes some calculations based on the boot environment. So okay, but this is the place to look to make those changes, and there's a lot of places we do that. And the thing that I would point out is there's two ways to do it. And this, I tried to document this clearly. So there's in the dev guide, there's documentation about this. If you have a very specific node role, like OS install, you can create a role for it. If you have a generic one, like network, most of the networks actually have exactly the same logic, and you can create a BarClamp network role, and the system will automatically resolve that as a default also. And if it doesn't find either of those, it goes all the way up to the generic role, and you don't get specialized behavior, you just get generic behavior. So there's two levels of role behavior overriding options. Does that make sense? Yes, BarClamp network will make your head explode because it's the most complex thing we have to do. Chris can tell you how we battled against some of these concepts in the first version of Crowbar 2. And some of that work we salvaged, and some of that work we had to rethink based on how we ended up with roles, which is a concept we didn't start with in Crowbar in the first pass at Crowbar 2. So look at network sparingly. If you go to the chef, you'll see what we did to override and inject attributes I'm using inject attributes incorrectly. This mechanism is how you generate data for the node roles based on the state transition. And there are places, let me go all the way back. So not only can you do this based on the, roles. Not only can you do it based on node role transitions, every node role also gets actually every role also has the opportunity to take actions when a node is created, deleted, or changed, and when a deployment is created or deleted. So you can, depending on how you override those things, there's a lot of places where you can decide to take action. And I'll say something that was it was confusing when we said it before, but I'll repeat it because it's worth understanding. These aren't asynchronous events. So all of these all these on handlers are run as part of the code, as in sequence with the code action. So don't expect that you're going to be able to take a long time doing some of these things. They're just meant to inject data or check things or do a test or something like that. They're meant to be small checks. Anything that needs to be asynchronous, that really is a node role in itself. Node roles are asynchronous. These things are just meant to provide specific overrides for node role behavior or node change behavior or deployment change behavior. They are, I'm not sure that I would say they're, I'm not sure I'd use that word. What do you mean by atomic? Yes. They are all within the transaction of changing the state of the state transition or of the action that they're like. So if a node is created, the on create actions must complete before the node is created or deleted or so yes, they are atomic, I guess, from that perspective. I would say they're executed in sequence with the action they're attached to. Right. There's no we don't parallelize any of these on events or handle them in different threads or anything like that. And Wayne, yes, if you want to override one of these events, you have to have a role, BarClamp class role overriding them. So yeah, it's any role of any sophistication will always have a role, a class associated with it in a BarClamp. And that's why you'll notice, even though I brought all of the BarClamps into one repo, for simplicity reasons, I still kept the BarClamp namespaces because otherwise the role names get really messy. So I didn't want to break the idea that these base models are in the base directory, and then all of the overrides are in their own namespaces. So the models, this is actually true no matter which version of if you're in the Crowbar 2 or the OpenCrowbar. It's the same model, it's just collapsed into one repo in OpenCrowbar. So the idea is that the models here are the base models, and anytime you want to do an override, you always create a namespace. By convention, it's always a BarClamp something namespace, and then the overrides go in that. And that's so if you follow that convention, you'll be able to pick up the default behavior. And if you want to see where that's done, it's actually done in the BarClamp import. So BarClamp imports where we actually bring in all these roles and figure out their names and their classes and stuff like that. And here's where we bring in their attributes. Yep, and it's not doing any test to make sure that the attributes have all their upstreams met. I'm not sure that we would, because we've been trying not to require that BarClamps have all their upstream requirements when they're imported. We allow that to be done after, only out at deployment time. That's a whole nother topic. All right, I'm 20 minutes over. It's for half of you at least. It's 5:20 on a Friday, and I would ask us that for a motion to adjourn. All right, everybody. Have a great weekend. Over the weekend, I will composite this recording and post it, and hopefully it'll be useful. Questions, and I'll do before I go off. Actually, maybe I'll do it in Nashua. We'll do another one of these. Let's say I'll try and find a morning time to do it so that we're not so unfair to the Ireland folk. But we'll do another one. Keep the train going. All right, everybody, have a great weekend.